Assalamu alaikum, comrades. I read a lot of books, and when I read academic books to learn more about history, to gain some insight, to focus in on a specific topic, when it comes to English language books about the Soviet Union, I often come across really strange claims and people trying their best to discredit or represent the Soviet Union in a negative light, and sometimes they reach like a lot. So today I'm going to be talking about an instance in this book, which is Battle Cry, Original Military Uniforms of the World, which is a series about uniforms, Red and Soviet Military and Paramilitary Services, Female Uniforms from 1941 to 1991, where they try to make the claim that, socialism, communism is when there is no underwear. Yes, they tried to make the claim that Soviet women did not have proper undergarments until the 1960s, among many other things. So let's get into that. Like many books of these kinds, the introduction is filled with the author trying to distance themselves away from anything that has to do with communism and any sort of adoration towards the Soviet Union, because if you like anything about the Soviet Union, you must be a bad person, right? So in the introduction, they basically express that they were just asked to do this book and that they are not a communist. They say, when my publisher contacted me and asked for a second book on uniforms worn by the military and paramilitary forces of the USSR, I decided on the ladies. I had no idea that the journey I was embarking upon was going to reveal the horrors of what Nazi Germany sympathizers did to women of the USSR during World War II. So they can acknowledge that it's the Nazis that are the problem, but let's continue. It's so horrific, in fact, that it's hard to write about. I had tears rolling down my cheeks and dripping into the keyboard. And they go on to say, I am not a communist, nor have I ever believed in this corrupt political ideology. But in this book, I honor every female, citizen and non-citizen of the USSR, who fought the Nazi horde. The cause was just, and evil must be defeated. Now, how much do they respect Soviet women? In the very first page where they depict a Soviet woman, just to show how respectful they are, they choose this image, which I might have to censor out, which is quite famous because it shows a Soviet female soldier with her breasts exposed, and one of them torn off by the fascists. So clearly we immediately start with the very first page with the utmost respect for Soviet women and their sacrifices. Yes, because that is how we humanize and respect women, by showing the most brutal things done to them. I'll never understand why men love to show the brutalization of women like this. The fetishization of women in war who face horrific realities? It's kind of disgusting, but that's where the book starts off. Now that's a pretty bad introduction, I think we can all agree, but it's actually only comes in second compared to some of the books I've read. Number one in the worst introduction to a book about the Soviet Union and Soviet women goes to this, which is ironically called Celebrating Women. It's actually an academic piece, and it's produced by the University of Pittsburgh and written by a university professor who taught at, I think, UCLA or one of the universities in California. And literally, the very first page where they put their, who it's dedicated to and stuff, that page, this is how their dedication goes. To Didipai, some dude, who urged me to abandon the godless communists and study British history. That is how she starts, and it shows her acknowledgement at the very beginning of a book called Celebrating Women, Gender, Festival Culture, and Bolshevik Ideology. And as you can imagine, she hates the Soviet Union. It's not a great book. Don't buy this. Don't read it. But yeah, these are the kinds of books that we're talking about, where right off the bat, people claiming to be some sort of expert or researcher on the topic explicitly shows their dislike for the people, system, and culture that they are within about the entirety of the thing that they are talking about. And yet, These books are used for sources all the time. Now, granted, I'm sure some people have the same complaints about myself, but I just want to point out that just because someone wrote a book doesn't mean that they are more knowledgeable than someone else or unbiased. Everyone has a bias, and people who get published tend to have a bias in favor of the system within its publishing. For instance, I've never gotten the green light to publish anything I've ever wanted to write. Not that I'm a great writer, I'm better at videos and talking, which is why I do this. So back to the book about uniforms. One of the things that they talk about most heavily is the fact that uniforms were scarce for women, that they weren't purpose-made for women until a little bit into World War II, and that they often used items meant for men. And I think this really ignores any sort of juxtaposition to where other militaries were at the time. Because while they didn't have as many purpose-made items immediately at the start of war for women, what army did at that time? So one of the things that this author says is during the research phase for this book, it became abundantly clear that prior to and during World War II, the Soviet Union's military planners had little time or inclination to provide the women in the Red Forces with appropriate uniforms. That's right. There were a lot of other pressing issues going on, like being immediately invaded, immediately losing all of their cartographers and topographic units in the initial invasion of the Soviet Union by the fascists, trying to heal their nation from the atrocities under the Tsar. There were a lot of other things going on that were a little bit more important than immediately getting uniforms for women. How many women were actually serving in the Red Forces when the Nazi horde invaded on June 22nd, 1941? It's unknown, but after a lot of initial resistance from his military commanders, Stalin decided that survival of his empire was more important than sexism. Interesting claim. Of course, there's no source, nothing to back up the fact that they are insinuating that Stalin was so sexist that he didn't want women in his army. Where did they hear that? Where is that from? Zero source. Seems like a personal assumption and anecdote. Consequently, the number of serving women rose dramatically, and strict adherence to uniform regulations took a back seat for a number of years. Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of strict uniform adherence during war. A lot of people just had what they had and used what they got, understandably. It's war. But then on the same page, they have a picture of a woman in uniform from 1937, wearing a matching top and skirt, so they did have some sort of coherent thing going on. So they start to mention that initially a lot of women pretended to be men to get into the military. Which, okay, yeah, some women did do that. They've done that throughout history in many parts of the world. It's nothing unique to the Soviet Union. But throughout this book, if you see these little gray boxes, those are all personal anecdotes, which add nothing and don't teach you anything about the uniforms. And one interesting one to point out is when talking about this, they say, note, over 100 female soldiers took part in the defense of the Winter Palace on the night of October 25th, 1917, which didn't go well with the Bolsheviks. What does that add? And also, where's your source? Like, what are you pulling from? I'm so confused by some of these. Here's another note. It is not possible in a book of this type to recount all the names and exploits of the fighting girls of the Red military forces during the Second World War. They're all heroines, but I have picked the ones I felt best suited this book. They say in the 1920s and 30s, women in the army were referred to as aviatrixes, and occasionally by the derogatory term petticoat pilots. In this book, a female qualified to fly an aircraft is a pilot. Yes, good pat on the back there. The military has been sexist and anti-woman since it was invented. Even in times of great turmoil, military commanders and politicians have been reluctant to call women to arms. In fact, many women took extreme measures just to get into the fight and disguising themselves as men going off to war. Yeah, and that can be said to all militaries all across the world, not just the Soviet Union. I mean, there's too many things to point out, really. There's a point where they mention that to the Soviets and in Bolshevik ideology, men and women were indistinguishable between one another, and there was a form of androgyny. They're trying to say that, like, communism took the femininity away and that women never had proper feminine clothing. you can look at pictures from the time periods they're talking about and see the kinds of clothes that were manufactured and made and what people wore. And there is a clear difference between masculine and feminine clothing, but I find it interesting. It just shows you the mindset of this person trying to claim that like communism took away proper femininity and stuff like that, when trying to also express that there weren't a lot of purpose-made female uniforms initially. They also say things like, well, women were only allowed to do medical work initially, and therefore didn't achieve the greatness that other soldiers had. Which is interesting, because if you know anything about being a medic during war, it's that you're not just a medic, you're also fighting for your life. Combat medic, right? Every medic on the field is a combat medic, and so they're not just healing people, they're also, shooting back and learn how to fight and shoot and so on and so forth. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting points they try to make, but let's get into my main point, which of course is socialism is when no underwear for women. So as someone who's interested in reenactment and living history, I was so excited to see that this book had a chapter on undergarments. It's information that's really hard to find in historical costuming, let alone in female uniform history. But then I was disappointed when I actually read what they had to say. So let me read you a little bit. Underwear. What can be said about ladies' underwear in the military? If there was an area of mystery, then this would be it. Photographs of women dressed only in underwear were strictly censored and controlled. In the book Night Witches by Bruce Miles, he interviewed veterans who spoke of being issued long johns, thermal underwear. No more was divulged regarding underwear, except that it was clear that the ladies brought civilian underwear along for the ride. It's common, even today, for women in the United States military. It's known that unisex was the general rule in a communist society. Yes, yes. In the 1930s, a one-size-fits-all bra was manufactured. By the 1970s, the number of different bra designs had increased to 9. But most women would have to knit items of underwear if they wanted something to fit properly. So a nation could send women into space, but couldn't provide them with proper undergarments. There's a lot to unpack here. So the manufactured one-size-fits-all bra. Again, there's no sources for any of these claims, which is really frustrating. But multi-sized undergarments for women did indeed exist prior to World War II in the Soviet Union. In general, in fashion history, it's not well documented. So what you have to go off of are people who lived during that time who did indeed wear underwear. Of course, it was more common for people to make their own, which wasn't like a negative thing, like they were forced to make their own. Like, no, they were used to making their own clothing, because prior to the Soviet Union, conditions were so bad that most people couldn't afford clothing and just made their own. And it was just a common skill that people had, and it wasn't something to be ashamed of. Being able to sew your own tailor-made clothing shouldn't be looked down upon. It was a necessity at the time, but it's also an incredibly valuable skill that we shouldn't discredit as being poor and unfortunate. But I think what's more loaded in this is what they mean by underwear, manufactured underwear. They're talking about a common type of underwear, a Western kind of underwear, that they are portraying as the standard. I think a lot of what they're saying kind of reeks of Western supremacy. They're trying to insinuate that if they don't wear the same exact kinds of underwear and manufacture the same kinds of underwear at the same rate as the rest of the Western world, they are therefore inferior and don't care about their women. They then go on to say, as I read, so you can send a woman into space, but you can't provide them with proper undergarments. Of course, the first woman went to space in 1962 or 63? 1960s, right? So they're trying to paint the Soviet Union all the way up to the 1960s as not having proper undergarments for women. Comment down below. I know some of you have babushkas who were born before the 1960s who can attest that they indeed had proper undergarments. You don't have to look far or ask very many people to get this sort of information. But it seems like this author made a lot of assumptions instead of asking people who were actually there. or using, I don't know, Google Translate. Now, of course, just like throughout this entire book, there's a cute little note below this. It says, "Note, it is said." It is said by who? I don't know. There's no source. It is said that women serving in the Red Army did not know of the existence of a chemisette, I don't know, it's a French word, and bra until it entered Romania in World War II. Let me reread that without the confusing word that I don't know, because I guess I'm just a peasant. It said that women serving in the Red Army did not know of the existence of bras until it entered Romania during World War II. It is said. Maybe some very, very rural peasants did not know of the existence of a certain kind of manufactured Western bra, but they indeed had their own undergarments. Even in rural Romania, let's look at rural Romania. They have certain kinds of folk vests that they wore that were adjustable for all sizes and all phases of life, that kept their chests in place. They didn't need a manufactured Western bra. They had their own sort of folk vest that served for that purpose. But that's just not good enough, I guess. But do you see, like, they're trying to insinuate that they're inferior and dumb and didn't know this very important thing of the modern Western bra, as if there weren't centuries of other alternatives to the modern Western bra, which in itself has taken on many forms since the 1940s. But even again, you don't have to search far to find advertisements for undergarments, to find patterns for making undergarments the same as the West, or even people wearing, as you see here, bullet bras from the 40s. There's lots of pictures and illustrations of people supported in activewear, and let's say it's not as fancy as Western underwear like this, but it's really not far off. It's the same exact sort of silhouette. So let me give you some whataboutism, as some of you have recently learned that term and love to use it. I have a great-grandmother who was in the UK during World War II, and she joined the military to do medical stuff, as many women did. At some point, things got dire. She became one of many women who learned to spot and aid in taking down enemy aircraft. And she had a lot of stories that I heard as a small child, that my mother heard growing up, and that my grandma still sometimes tells, about how she found herself in situations where she was days, sometimes weeks, during raids, and when enemy aircraft was spotted, she would bleed onto her clothing because she wasn't provided with proper sanitary products. And she would just have to go on with life bleeding out on her period. Now, that's not to say every single woman in the United Kingdom went through that experience, or even every woman in the military was put in the situation where they had to do other tasks other than the ones that they signed up for. It was an unfortunate situation, and it's one that stuck with her for the rest of her life, to the point that she was retelling it up until her death. Now imagine if I took my great-grandmother's experience, where she bled through her clothing because she wasn't given proper undergarments and sanitary products during World War II in the United Kingdom, and I defined the average female experience of living in the United Kingdom up until the 1960s by that experience. And I just insinuated that, yeah, all the women in the UK, they didn't have sanitary products. I mean, look at this woman. She just bled right through in a ditch. Up until the 1960s. Does that sound ridiculous? It is, right? But that's exactly what they're doing when they're insinuating things about the Soviet Union based off of just a single experience or a couple of experiences that they don't even have a source for. You see why that's frustrating, right? You see why that's not a fair representation, right? You see how it's inherently cherry-picked to give off a certain impression, right? Books talking about the Soviet Union like this is so common in the English language. It's hard enough to find a neutral telling of Soviet history or the average Soviet experience, let alone a positive one. And let's entertain that worst case scenario, women didn't have underwear at all, even though they were given, men's underwear. Let's say they didn't have any underwear at all. Do you think that's their biggest concern? in the Red Army in World War II, actively being invaded and in constant life or death situations, that's the thing you want to pick a fight about? Whether or not they had proper undergarments? Really, there were bigger concerns. And like, we're not even getting into the context of what the treatment of women was like in the nations of all of the Allied forces, let alone the treatment of women within their militaries. US had women serving in the medical field, in the military, and they were segregated. But yeah, I don't think I have a proper conclusion. I just wanted to share my frustration with you and show how common these sorts of sentiments and claims are in the books that I have to read every day for my research. I'm sure a lot of you have read similar things. Please, down below, share with me some of the most interesting or outlandish claims that you've read in books that are meant to be unbiased on the Soviet Union. I don't personally believe that there is such a thing as being unbiased. I state pretty clearly over and over again that I focus on the more positive aspects because I believe it's missing. But anyone who claims to be completely unbiased and in the middle is absolutely lying to you, and perhaps themselves if they don't realize it yet. Because history isn't about having one unbiased source or two unbiased sources. It's about researching multiple perspectives, all of them biased in their own way, and perhaps coming to your own conclusions, or in most cases, finding a narrative that fits your way of thinking best. It's just how it ends up being, you know? There are many truths in history, and some say that the Soviet Union didn't have proper undergarments. I suppose that's a truth for some. It's a truth for the author of this book and wherever their mysterious sources came from. But it's also a truth that war is war, and there's a lot more pressing issues to deal with than potentially not having proper underwear. But I mean, less clothing to potentially soil in your fear, I suppose. Alright, comrades, be inspired by history and be critical of what you read. Please. This is too common. Don't let it slip by you. Point it out. I think you'll help other people learn and recognize these extreme, not just biases, but like outlandish claims and inaccuracies. If you enjoy what I do here and would like to support me, I have links down below towards things like my Patreon, my Instagram, my TikTok, PayPal if you want to support me in a one-time donation. I don't make a whole lot of money doing this, so I appreciate the financial support so I can keep doing this research and having time to produce more content like this. Anyways, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum.